Hey everyone, and welcome to Building SaaS on AWS. My name is Gunnar Grosch, developer advocate here at AWS. And this is the show for you who are building a SaaS product, hopefully on AWS. We have this show every other week, and we dive deep into the topic of SaaS and building SaaS. So we want to have an interactive show. If you have any questions, comments, do post them in the chat and we'll do our best to answer them. But every week we have a specific topic to dive deep into. And so we have this week as well. And this week I'm happy to be joined by our old friend Keith. Welcome back, Keith.
Hello, thank you for having me back on the show, Gunnar.
So tell us about the previous show you were on.
Absolutely. So I previously joined the show to discuss with one of our partners, UME Academy, and we went through their architecture, we went through their application, and they provided a demonstration for us.
But we're not going to do that this time. It's Keith solo show this time, and we're going to dive into the topic of billing and metering. Super important topic for any SaaS out there, I'd say.
Absolutely.
And before we jump into the topic, just remind people of who Keith is.
Sure. I'm a senior partner solution architect on the SaaS Factory team. This is a team that helps customers build, deploy, and architect software as a service on AWS from both a business and technical perspective.
But this show is all about tech, so we're definitely going to dive deep into the tech. And as I mentioned, billing and metering. So let's get to it straight away, Keith.
Absolutely.
Why is, or rather, what makes it challenging to implement something as crucial as billing for any SaaS product?
Absolutely. So the interesting part about billing and metering for a SaaS product is that it is really at an intersection of both the business and technical sides. This is not quite this. Not all of the topics for SaaS are going to meet at that intersection. Of course, there's going to be some sharing between either side. So some topics will lean more technical, others lean more business, but the business side really influences how the billing and metering is going to be implemented. So how with the decisions that the business side makes for how to drive revenue from their SaaS product is going to drive how the billing and metering technical side is going to be implemented.
And then let's talk about different types of billing for a SaaS product. Can we talk about how you typically see customers implement billing?
Absolutely. So before we begin that, there's a wide range of billing topics and a wide range of different billing methodologies. So I'm not going to be able to cover every single option that you might see, but I'll cover some of the more common ones. The first would be probably the simplest, where you have, and most common when you have a customer who's migrating from a legacy, maybe single tenant application to a SaaS application that's multi-tenant. You'll see customers negotiate contracts one-on-one with the SaaS application provider. So this isn't going to be something like where a customer puts in a credit card and then creates some sort of a subscription. This is going to be a negotiated contract between the application provider and the customer. And I've seen this a couple of times, and as I said, it's especially common in sort of the legacy to SaaS application migration space. And this will be very much along the lines of a fixed cost per year, per month. And the actual transfer of funds is usually done through something like a wire transfer. And that's really not something that is implemented inside of the actual application. So there may be a little flag that says something like, oh, this person is enabled for this particular feature set, but the actual billing work is done outside of the application. And this is a very easy way for certain customers to get started because it doesn't take a lot of change from their current process. They're used to negotiating contracts, they're used to getting paid in a certain way. It's very straightforward to move on to that model when you're building a SaaS application. Beyond that, there are going to be probably some of the more common application or some of the more common billing methods that you might see when you're using SaaS applications yourself. This could be something as simple as a single product with a single price. So a good example of this might be a product that you pay for $20 a month, and you get all of the features, and there's no other tier. It's just very straightforward. And that's something that you might see inside of a consumer application. So something that's more business to consumer rather than business to business, although there's no real reason to exclude business to business there. It just seems to be more common with business to consumer. And then finally, there are the multi-tier types of approach. I guess not finally, but there's another approach. There's the multi-tier approach as well, where you have a different tier for each feature set, different limits, different abilities to use the application. And you might commonly see this as something like a developer, a business, and an enterprise support enterprise tier. So usually the lower end tiers are going to be cheaper, but they may not be as featureful, or they might not have limits that are as high. Storage, for example, you may only have access to 1 gigabyte of storage versus an enterprise plan, which might have several gigabytes of storage, for example. And then finally, the one that we'll be focusing on a lot here today are the usage-based billing methods. So this is actually pretty unique because it allows you to bill your customers based on what they're using rather than just some flat rate. And this is useful for customers in that they can only pay for what they're consuming. AWS is a great example of this. You only pay for what you consume. Yeah. So the billing providers that exist today allow for these types of granular billing methodologies. So that way you can charge your customer only what they're paying for, and this results in a much better customer experience.
And I think just by you talking about that, it's obvious why billing is so tightly connected to metering, because having that type of billing method or model means that you need to know exactly what your customers or your users are actually using on the platform.
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
So then let's talk about that then. What kind of technical implementations does that actually mean, these different billing methods?
Sure. So I'll exclude the contract-based billing method because, as I said, that isn't really something that is integrated deeply into the application. So let's talk about the different tiering methods here. So this is a pretty straightforward integration because you don't actually have to record usage for that customer. You should still record usage and other metrics associated with customer interaction with your application, simply because you want to make sure that they are staying within the bounds of what tier they've selected, and also too to make sure that the application is able to respond to the load at that particular level as you expect. So this isn't a reason to not collect metrics. It's just that you don't have to report it back to the billing provider. Right. In that particular case, you can simply create a customer inside of the application, inside of the billing provider, or some sort of representation of the customer, and then create a subscription that will allow you to bill based on whatever tier the customer is signed up for. So from that perspective, the integration is usually going to take place in a couple of places. Onboarding, when the customer selects the initial tier that they want to be involved with, or when the customer decides to upgrade or downgrade a tier. But apart from that, most billing providers that offer this type of integration are going to handle the subscription, handle the payment, and handle the actual storing of customer data. So the integration points for the tiering are quite limited. Whereas with the usage, you have not only the onboarding part as well as the change if tiers are involved, because you can mix and match these two. You can have tiers and usage. So you'll have the onboarding part and any sort of updates that come after that, as well as the periodic reporting of usage.
Right. So based on that, then, how do you actually measure this, the usage? I'll guess we'll dive deeper into that later on, but to be able to actually know what your customers, what their usage is on your platform. But that probably ties back to the business decisions that you talked about earlier as well.
Absolutely, it does.
Every SaaS product or solution probably has their own metrics for what to actually measure and what to actually bill their customers for.
That's correct. And it usually is, I mean, this may seem obvious, but it's going to tie back to what your cost drivers are. So if your cost drivers are primarily compute, so if you have some sort of application that relies heavily on compute, then your usage may be billed as part of compute, or if it's primarily storage driven, then it will be tied more to what each of the customers are going to be using. But it can also be a composite metric as well, and that might actually be a little bit more interesting for SaaS providers, because if you don't have a situation where compute or storage or data transfer or something else dominates the cost driver, then you can have a composite metric as well, where you tie in maybe a third of the cost is related to compute, a third is related to storage, and a third is related to data transfer or something else. And then you create this composite metric that might just be some generic usage metric that is abstracted away from the end customer. That's all they see.
So, and previously you mentioned billing providers. Do you see that many of the SaaS providers, the customers you're working with building SaaS, do they use third-party billing solutions, or do they build their own billing solutions?
Sure. So it depends on the customer, because some of the customers, especially in the enterprise space, are going to have their own billing infrastructure already in place. And this is especially true for very large companies that may deal with large amounts of funds moving back and forth. And they're not going to accept credit cards essentially for their product. So they're not going to have the same type of integrations that a company that targets a lower price point will. So I do see, though, generally customers or partners in this space will use billing providers, because if you start taking credit card numbers and you start having to deal with the credit card networks, and you start having to build out invoicing and all of the stuff that goes along with billing, it's a very, very onerous task, and there's a lot of compliance that goes along with it, most notably the PCI DSS framework.
And when we talk, especially about SaaS, we often talk about removing a lot of that undifferentiated heavy lifting. And I guess running your own billing solution is definitely part of that.
Absolutely. It's a very onerous task to run your own billing solution. If you can avoid it, I would absolutely recommend not doing that.
I see a lot of chatter in the chat. That's great. Keep comments, questions coming. We have Bill there to help out answer any questions as well. So keep it coming throughout this hour. So Keith, we are 13 minutes into the show. I think it's time to start showing something, not just talking about it. So I'll bring up your screen share. There we go. And yeah, where do we go from here? We have a sense of what billing actually means and why metering is important.
Yep. So we'll focus on this show. We'll focus on Stripe on this show. So Stripe is one of many billing providers out there. However, I've built a reference implementation around it. I've integrated a billing and metering solution with Stripe. So we'll focus on this because it's one that is available to anyone who's watching this show. They can go to the GitHub, and I'm sure you'll include that inside of the show notes for this. You can go to the GitHub and look at the code here that we're about to go over. So let's start with the fundamental parts of what the Stripe integration looks like. Every single person inside of a SaaS application, every single customer of a SaaS application needs to have some sort of representation inside of the billing provider. So inside of a SaaS application, we commonly talk about the idea of a tenant. So a tenant is not the same thing as a user. A user can be part of a tenant. You may have a one-to-one mapping of a user and a tenant, so there may be one user for one tenant. But the tenant construct is what makes SaaS unique, in that it's a representation of some entity that you as a SaaS provider are dealing with. So this could be another business, this could be an individual. Generally in the B2B space, the business to business space, we see the tenant represented as a business. So you will have a business and then multiple users within that business. There's some nuance to this, there can be some exceptions, but that's generally what we see. So in this case, when you first integrate your billing provider into your SaaS application, you need to create a representation of that tenant inside the actual billing provider. And in this case, for Stripe, this will be a customer. So here you see an example customer. This could be a business name here. Could be company 1, 2, or 3, whatever it is. And the customer is going to have a couple of things associated with them. They're going to have a payment method. And again, this is actually very key here. The billing provider is going to store all of that for you. You really, it's very difficult to properly store credit card numbers because you have to be in compliance with PCI DSS. And by having a billing provider do this for you, you really save yourself a lot of compliance work because they have to remain compliant. They're the ones keeping the compliance there. So they can store the credit card number. And then this will be very important when it comes to subscriptions. Mm. So as you can see here, this particular customer is subscribed to a usage-based SaaS application. We'll get to that in just a moment. The usage-based SaaS application in this case is a product that I've created. And again, we'll jump over that in just a second. And the key information here that needs to be focused on is this right here, the subscription item ID. This is the relationship between the customer and the subscription. And this is what we'll use later on inside of the product. So just very briefly back over here as well, you can also see invoices generated for the customer. So you can have Stripe generate invoices, which means that they'll get an email. You can customize this a little bit as well, and they'll be able to see what their usage was, what their bill is. And again, this is something that you do not have to bill because Stripe handles it for you.
Would you say that a tenant always equals a customer?
In this case, yes, a Stripe customer. We'll preface it that with a Stripe customer, because you don't want to have individual users inside of Stripe. It doesn't make sense because the users inside of a tenant might not necessarily be responsible for billing. I'm sure there's someone in the tenant that is, but ultimately the normal user of the SaaS isn't going to be the billing administrator as well. So to create a customer per user is just, most of them aren't going to be dealing with any sort of payment information, so it wouldn't make sense to do that.
And of course, as you mentioned, there are other billing providers out there. But
absolutely,
what does Stripe? Why is Stripe so interesting as a SaaS developer? Would you say?
Absolutely, they have a lot of API-driven development. So almost all of the functionality that I'm showing here is also available through APIs, and they also have a large number of SDKs. In the case of the code that we'll show later, I use the Java SDK. So the developer experience is very strong with Stripe. I found it very simple to integrate this application with Stripe using their SDKs. And further too, they actually have a pretty nifty testing framework as well. It's a Docker container that you can run locally, and it will allow you to mock out the API endpoint, so that way you can run local tests or unit tests on your own host or inside of, or as part of your build and deploy process. So it's a really strong developer experience overall.
And that API or SDK part of it, that could, for instance, mean onboarding tenants. So easily be able to add customers into Stripe as well.
Absolutely. Yes. Anything, at least in my experience, anything that I saw that was available through the management console here was also available through the API.
And that's great. Everything we can remove that could potentially be a manual process. Otherwise, is great to be able to use APIs or SDKs.
Exactly. That's exactly correct.
So tell me a bit more about that Docker container.
Sure.
Was that something that you used for when you built out your example environment?
Yes. I wrote some unit tests for this application. You can see those on the GitHub as well. And if you look inside of there should be some documentation in there that talks about how you spin up this container. And the Stripe integration tests actually make use of that Docker container. And it, again, is very convenient to be able to do that because I don't have to worry about internet connectivity. I don't have to worry about setting up API keys because Stripe uses API keys for authentication. I don't have to worry about really any of that. I can just run local, and I'm not cluttering up my test environment here. As you can see, it says test data up here. So this is my test environment. I'm not cluttering that up with other test resources or anything like that. It's all done locally. So and represents their API. So it's very convenient.
All right. So should we see some in action then, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll go ahead and start with the tenant onboarding part. So this part is key because you can't start tracking metrics until you have a tenant onboarded. So there's two different parts of this that are going to be relevant. when you first onboard a tenant to your application, you have to create this customer inside of Stripe, as we've just said, and then you have to onboard it for this particular implementation. There are a lot of other ways to do this. This is the way I chose to do it, just to make it a little bit easier to understand. But you can do it in other ways. For the billing implementation, what I did was I'm using a DynamoDB table, and inside of the DynamoDB table, there are obviously several items. One of the items is going to be a tenant configuration. And what this does is it maps a tenant identifier that you pick. So this could be a UUID, it could be anything really that you decide to identify your tenant with, and it maps that to the subscription item that I just mentioned. This item that relates the customer to the subscription. And this is important because that particular mapping is that particular identifier is what's used to report usage. You don't report it based on customer, you don't report it based on subscription, you report usage based on that subscription subscription item, and that is what is stored inside of this this configuration for a tenant. You can see that here on line 97. So
we
that's
can
what.
zoom in a step or two more, so make sure that people actually see it.
Oh,
I shared a link to the repo in the chat now, so people can follow along as well if they wish. All right. Go ahead, Kid.
Oh yeah, sure. So the subscription identifiers here, and there's also two. This is just some DynamoDB artifacts here because of how you have to put items into the update statement. But that's really what this tenant configuration does inside of the application. All it does is map this subscription identifier to a to your tenant. So that way, when the billing information is reported and when it's aggregated and put up to Stripe, the billing implementation knows where to send that usage to.
Right. And then next, when we have that in place.
Yep. So once that's in place, you'll have to work with the actually reporting the usage to Stripe. So we have to take a few steps back before we discuss how that's actually done, because we need to discuss another Stripe concept as well before we look at the actual implementation. So within Stripe, there is this idea of a product, and then there's a price. So one product can have multiple prices. Inside of the tiered application approach, what you would have here is a single product. So this could be your application with 3 different pricing tiers. And as you can see here, I have 3 down here at the bottom. I have a bronze, a silver, and a gold. Each of them have different prices. As you go up higher, the price gets higher. This is very common inside of the SaaS application industry. And but there's no usage here at all. This is very much in the case of I onboard a tenant, they select their tier, and then they don't really have much interaction with the billing provider unless they need to update some sort of billing information, or if they need to look at their invoice or anything like that. There's not a lot of application integration here. So that's the pretty straightforward way to go here. This is the more relevant one for the usage based application. So you can see here that there's a single product and then there's a single price. You can have more than one price, but this is one of the prices here. So you may have a single product, but you might have multiple prices if you wanted to have maybe a different way to subscribe. I don't know, you could do something like this. Or if you wanted tiered pricing where as you use more, the price per unit decreases, then you could add that inside of the single price here. It's a different price. It's a different pricing model that you can add within the same price. So one product, multiple prices, or one or more prices, at least one. And in this situation here, you have a unit. So what is a unit? So you see it's per unit, per month, per year, could be really any sort of time period. The unit is just an integer. It's a whole number. Stripe doesn't impose any sort of opinion on what that unit is. So you may have a situation where you want to bill on milliseconds of compute or gigabytes used or number of requests made or something like that. And as long as it can be represented as a whole number, then you can add it as a unit to bill to your customer. So you can't have any sort of fractional numbers, any sort of decimal places or anything like that. They all have to be whole numbers, but you just you have to figure out what that representation is and then report that unit to Stripe. because Stripe isn't going to be able to say this is per second, per millisecond, whatever it is. It's just a very basic number here, which really makes it very flexible. So with these two here, you've set these products up inside of Stripe. You've set the pricing up inside of Stripe, and this is going to be in conjunction with the business side as well of your application. They are really going to be the primary drivers of this, and this is really just the implementation of what they've decided for the application. Once that's done, then there is another part of this billing implementation, and that's actually gathering the metrics. This is actually pretty straightforward. So we'll discuss the larger architecture at the very end, just to give an overview. But basically, there's an event put onto an event bridge, and then that's consumed by a Lambda function. And what that Lambda function does is just put the event inside of a DynamoDB table. So you've got this DynamoDB table that also contains the tenant configuration information. It also takes the individual billing events. And what that is doing, it puts the tenant identifier here. You can see that on line 85. It puts the time that the event occurred. So that would be in epoch time with milliseconds, because you want to make sure that you're fairly granular, because you don't want two event collisions to happen. And there's also to the quantity that you put into place as well. So this could be this particular, it doesn't have to be always be one here. It can be 5, it can be 10, it can be whatever your application deems necessary. So you don't always have to put just 111 all the way down. It can be any sort of whole number here. And then what that does is it will then put the request into the DynamoDB table. It's very straightforward here. You're just recording individual items as they're put in. And why? Why not just go directly to Stripe? I think is probably a good question to ask here, because you could, inside of your application, just use the Stripe SDK and then go directly to the Stripe billing provider. So you want to make sure that when you are building applications, you want to, especially third-party integrations, you want to make sure that the API limits are respected, and that you don't have a situation where any sort of intermittent connectivity or anything like that might cause, or any sort of intermittent failures might cause problems recording these metrics. So by putting them into an intermediate storage medium like DynamoDB, you're recording all these metrics, and then the integration with the billing provider or the third-party integration is going to then be abstracted from the actual application, so you get that little bit of buffer space. So I did this with the DynamoDB table just so that if there were any sort of issues or anything like that with the actual billing provider, I wouldn't miss billing events.
That makes sense. And then these billing events are you're collecting them in a DynamoDB table, and then you're sending them to the Stripe API. How often?
Sure. So that's actually a very good question, because it's not immediate, as evidenced by this. So there are 2 steps to sending this over to Stripe. First, the first step is going to be actually aggregating these events. So this could be this is done inside of my application on a per minute basis, and I'll get to why that's important in just a moment. So every minute there is a scheduled CloudWatch event that runs that triggers a step function machine, or a step function flow, I guess is the correct word. It triggers that flow, and what that does is first aggregate the events, and then eventually we'll publish to Stripe. It'll publish to Stripe. So we'll get to that second part in just a moment. So the aggregation, what that does is it pulls a list of tenants, and then it will then get the billing events for each of those tenants by querying the DynamoDB table here. You can see that here on line 119. That is the query request, and what this does is it looks for a tenant ID, and then with event prefix attribute for the billing events. So it's pulling all of the billing events from the DynamoDB table. And again, this makes use of the really neat features inside of DynamoDB, just to highlight that here on line 121, where you can query based on what key begins with. So it allows you to do some filtering there without using the actual filter function. So it pulls all of these billing events in, and you can see here that it will then go through, and then down here on line 148, it will add those to an array list here, and then it will send those back to the requester. Once the billing events have been pulled from the DynamoDB table, you have to categorize the events. And what happens here is that the events have to be put into minute buckets, so to speak. We'll call them minute buckets. That's how the aggregation happens. So the events could have happened at any point inside of a particular hour, minute, etc. And you have to categorize these events into, and this is done on a per tenant basis. You have to categorize these events into the minute buckets that they have to get this aggregation that you eventually will send to Stripe. Notably here too, it'll skip over the current minute because you don't want to have there might be if it's in the current minute, then there might be events that still come in, so you don't want to aggregate them just yet. So once it categorizes those events, it will then go over and initialize the item. So it'll initialize the aggregate item. It'll create the item inside of DynamoDB, and then it will put the request as a transaction. So this is actually kind of interesting because there's a situation where you have all these billing events here, but you want to get rid of those as well because you don't really need them after the aggregations happened. But you also too want to make sure that you don't have a situation where you've kind of got this partial write and a partial delete where you've written the update, but you've deleted maybe half of them because half of the billing events that contributed to that aggregate because some sort of failure happened inside of your application. Then your table's left in this very odd state. Think of like journaling in a file system. So what this does is it makes use of DynamoDB's transaction feature. So it'll have 24 deletes and then one update, 24 deletes and then one update until the actual updates are done. So that way you have a pretty consistent experience with data inside of a DynamoDB table. So that's the aggregation experience. Again, done completely within DynamoDB. It's not interacting with Stripe at this point at all.
Right. And then we have that data aggregated and we are, I guess, ready to push it to Stripe.
Absolutely. So that will happen in a different Lambda function as well. So this is the only Lambda function inside of the entire architecture that actually interacts with Stripe in any way. If you've noticed here before, the ingestion, the aggregation, all of that is done completely within the DynamoDB table. And this was intentional because this architecture can be used to integrate with other billing providers. And the actual application doesn't need any modifications now because it's going to be using the same endpoint, but the actual end SaaS application doesn't really have any need to know how the billing provider is actually doing the billing. So as long as it's sending the events, and this last part is able to report the events to whatever billing provider, in this case Stripe, then there's no changes necessary if a person were to decide to change billing providers or use this as a reference for other billing providers. So that abstraction is pretty important there. So what happens here? There's a situation where you need to report something to Stripe because that's ultimately how customers get billed. First, you have to check the upcoming invoice expiration. So going back very quickly to the customer here, you'll see that they have individual invoices here. Each of those invoices has a closing time. Pretty common with invoices, they measure a particular period. They're not continuous, they're not a stream, so there's discrete invoices, in this case per month. This application, in order to, again, not make too much use of the Stripe API, will check the invoice closing time. And if the invoice has not closed yet, it will not report the usage. So it will continue to aggregate, but it won't report the usage to Stripe. And this is important because if I were to report the usage to Stripe every single minute, this would create quite a lot of traffic to the Stripe API. And if you have a lot of tenants, if you're doing a lot of reporting, this may become problematic because you could run into some sort of API limit or something like this, and that would not be a good experience for your application. So it checks the upcoming invoice expiration date. If the invoice isn't expired yet, then nothing happens. The tenant is just skipped over, and then the next tenant is processed. In this case, I don't know what that invoice expiration is when I first onboard the tenant. So that particular attribute of the tenant configuration is going to be empty. But I also didn't want to have to integrate some sort of Stripe. I didn't want to have to integrate Stripe into the first onboarding function. So I confined it all here. It checks the upcoming invoice expiration date. If it's empty, it will retrieve it. and then populate the DynamoDB table with that particular attribute. So that way in the future, you'll know when the DynamoDB, or you'll know instead of the DynamoDB table when the actual expiration is going to happen. And then when, of course, when it expires, it updates as well. So that's why this happens here. So it checks for the invoice expiration. And then once that is done, let's assume that the invoice expired, it's closed already. You have to add usage to the subscription item. Now, this is a pretty, it's a nuance of using Stripe. This may not be the same for every billing provider. Once the invoice closes, you have 5 minutes at the end for any sort of reporting. So because I'm not reporting this to Stripe every single time an event comes in or after every aggregation, I have to, and I can only report it after the invoice closes. I have a very narrow window here, where I can start reporting usage. That's where the 5 minutes come, or that's where the every minute run comes from, because I want to, as soon as the invoice closes, I want to report that usage as soon as possible before that 5 minutes ends. So that is a factor of just how Stripe is designed. You have at 5 minutes at the end after an invoice closes to report usage, and that's what I'm taking advantage of here. If you look at this particular product here, you can see, let me just go in here. If you look here, you can see that the aggregation mode is sum across all usage records during the period. There's a couple of different options that you can select here. You can select just set the number, so at the end, you just set it and then it's done. However, that doesn't offer that extra 5 minutes at the end, which means that you could miss a couple of events that come in at the end of an invoice. So if you said, I want to do this a minute before the invoice closes, you could still get that in there, but you're going to miss some of those events that might come in at that last minute. So that's what that particular 5 minute window is only available with this aggregation mode set to sum. So just something to keep in mind here. All right, so looking at
just help me understand that with that 5 minute window.
Sure.
What happens if you miss it then?
If you miss it, then you can add it to the next bill. Like you can add it to the next invoice. That part shouldn't be terribly difficult to add here.
All right.
So you just have to add it to the next bill. Again, that's not a great customer experience. And when I was testing this, I didn't really have a lot of problems getting all of the events put into a particular 5 minute window. So I didn't really have a whole lot of issues with that. And remember too, another nuance here as well is that you have different expiration times for each tenant.
Yeah.
So you don't want to create this thundering herd problem where each tenant expires at exactly the same time, and then you have to report all of your usage at once. That, again, you may end up running into some sort of rate limit. When you have a new tenant onboarded, it creates an invoice that will, or it creates a subscription where the invoice will expire at some time that the tenant signed up. So that way, your usage should, in theory, be pretty spread out throughout the day of Stripe. It's not going to be all at once, all at noon, for example, Pacific time. It's going to be at times throughout the day.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to not adjust your subscription windows to follow the month, for instance, instead have them based on when they signed up or something like that.
Exactly. Let Stripe handle that for you, and then just build your application around that.
All right. So moving on then.
Yeah. So you've got the aggregation, you've got the invoice time, you've got the usage. This is when you add the usage to the subscription item. Remember at the very beginning, we talked about the tenant configuration that's in DynamoDB, that subscription item, that ID, this identifier here. Just pull this up here just to remind everyone. This identifier here is what is stored inside of the DynamoDB table and inside of a tenant configuration. And that's what's used to report the usage. So you have to pass it in when you're sending it here, and you can see that right here. It's around here somewhere. There we go. It's instead of a different function. Create, here it is right here. Subscription item ID on line 188. You can see that it also passes in the parameters up here. One of the interesting parts up here is item potency key. This is actually a pretty interesting feature of Stripe to help prevent double reporting. So let's say for a moment that you report usage to Stripe and then you don't get a response back. Maybe your instance failed, or maybe there's some sort of problem that happens when you're running this. You don't know if it got reported or not. Did Stripe record this? Did it get an error for a response? I'm not sure. So each of the aggregation entries is going to have an idempotency key, and this is just it's just a random string that you send with a request, and Stripe records that. So if you send the same request again with the same idempotency key, the application is going to or the Stripe is going to send back a response that says you've already submitted this, and this helps prevent double billing or double submitting. So that way, if you get the response back, then you can just mark the aggregate, the response back that the idempotency key has already been seen. Then you can just mark that as already submitted and then move on. So that's just a little nifty feature of Stripe that will allow you to prevent double billing. And then once that's done, this is done for every tenant. This submission of the aggregate items, and it's done on a per minute basis. So the most that you'll ever see submitted for a customer submitting an event at every minute of the day would be about 1,440 or so, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, when I was working on this, minutes per day. So there won't ever be more than that per tenant. And then this is usually pretty quick here as well. Most tenants aren't going to be having events at different times of day, usually just because of time zones, because of usage patterns that correlate with the business day, etc. So, and then it depends on what the actual application is sending to this billing implementation. So once those aggregation events are submitted, then you have to mark them as submitted, again, just to prevent the unnecessary traffic to the Stripe API. So you've got the aggregation event. It's just a Boolean attribute inside of the DynamoDB item. That's what's done here as well.
Yeah.
And then it's done, and then it just continues to run over and over again.
That's it.
Yeah,
sounds
pretty straightforward.
Sounds easy.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of little edge cases, but it's
yeah, for sure. But back to Stripe then, and this is everything around this is giving me flashbacks to actually building my own billing solutions back in the days before Stripe and things like that existed.
Yep.
Let's think about different scenarios that we often see in terms of discounts or any type of ad hoc billing and things like that.
Yep.
Is Stripe able to handle that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's going to be primarily done through the product section here. So if you were to add another price here, for example, you can select several different models here. There's package pricing, where you can say it costs $10 per some number of units. It can be reoccurring, it can be one time, it could be monthly, it could be every 3 months, every 6 months, it could be custom. So there's a lot of different ways to work on this. And also too, by the way, if you want to do usage, the metering that we just discussed, you have to check that little box. So just as an aside. And there's also graduated pricing where you have the first X number of units are this price, and the next number of units are this price. And this is very similar to what you see with AWS, where S3, for example, will have number of gigabytes up to this point is this much, number of gigabytes beyond that is this much, etc. So you have that type of billing available. And then there's also volume pricing, where you can buy in bulk. So a lot of different options here. You can also too just create ad hoc products if there's something really special that you need to do for a particular tenant, and then associate it with that tenant. So remember, you've got a subscription associated with the tenant, and that subscription is the intersection of the customer and the product. Cool. So yeah, a lot of flexibility here for any sort of unique billing situation you might encounter.
I think that's it's really great to see. Just meaning that you have to focus on actually capturing those events, the things that you want to meter, and the things that you want to bill your customers based on, but then leave the rest up to actually Stripe in this case.
Exactly. It's very helpful to have this type of infrastructure already in place, because as you can see here, the integration alone and actually capturing the events was pretty in depth. It was pretty. It took a bit to get correct, but now imagine having to also build payment processing, secure storage of credit cards, invoicing, etc. It's really convenient to have this type of product available.
So can we then maybe switch over to talk about the architecture around this solution that you've shared with us?
Absolutely. Let me zoom in a little bit. Does that look good?
Yeah, I think that's good.
All right, very good. So we discussed the individual Lambda functions that were written for this. You can see here the process billing event function, the onboard new tenant function. They both go. They write the results to a DynamoDB table, and then there's this step function workflow at the bottom, where the billing event aggregation happens, and then the Stripe billing publish function publishes a Stripe. And then there's that time-based event over on the side that's similar to a cron job, but it's available through CloudWatch events. One part we didn't really touch on here is the event bridge up here at the top. And this part is interesting because it allows for an asynchronous workflow. So billing is important to your SaaS application, but if you miss an event, it shouldn't be detrimental to the performance of your application, which means that it should be an asynchronous type of event. So let's say that you have a situation where you're billing on the number of requests that a customer makes to your application. And if you were to do synchronous if you were to do a synchronous type of event where you would say invoke this process billing event function directly, now your application is going to be waiting on that function. It may only take 100 milliseconds, but it's still 100 milliseconds that adds up over time to other steps in your application. By using the event bridge, placing an event on the event bridge in a particular format that the process billing event function understands, and then it's done asynchronously. So that way, your application, all it needs to do is just send the event over to event bridge and then move on. It's not waiting for a response. It's not waiting for, well, I guess it's waiting for a response from event bridge, but it's not waiting for a processing response or anything like that. So it's much faster than if you were to do this synchronously. So by building in this asynchronous process, you don't have to worry so much about having to slow down your application because of billing.
Right.
And I think that's pretty important.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
And based on this solution, then you could basically create those events for any type of thing within your SaaS product.
Yes, that's correct. You could have events for user creation. You could have events for if you have some sort of resource creation, you could put that on an event bridge as well. So any sort of event that happens, and also too, the billing is just one part of this. You can have other Lambda functions subscribe to that event bridge as well, and then you could have this really pretty interesting event-driven architecture where you put some service does something like creates a resource, and maybe something needs to know about that, so it will then go and do something else based on that. And the event bridge can serve as a sort of this bus that everyone can subscribe to inside of the application. So it's a lot of features here for sure.
Yeah.
A lot of possibilities.
Yeah, and that data that you store in DynamoDB in this case, you could then potentially use that for other types of reports or whatever. Absolutely. As well.
Absolutely. So I didn't illustrate it here or integrate it with the application, but for sure you could put an API that you could use API gateway and a bunch of other Lambda functions to use this DynamoDB table as a source for reporting for anything like that, really. So that way you don't have to go directly to Stripe if you don't want to. This also too leads into this part over here, the billing provider API key. So if you don't want to give everyone inside of your company access to Stripe, that makes sense. There should be particular administrators to this. Then you can also give them the billing data that is inside of this DynamoDB table by exposing it to another API. So it's a lot of possibilities here by storing the data as in an intermediate data store rather than just storing it directly on Stripe.
And you've touched on this a couple of times, but removing Stripe from this is basically just that single Stripe box towards the bottom there.
Yep.
And you could put in basically any type of billing provider that feeds on the same type of information.
That's correct. Yes, as long as, again, this will require much more modification to the application that's not modeled here, but you also, for this particular area here, all you have to do is modify that function at the bottom. And as long as the billing provider takes that unit measure, where it's just taking that integer, then it can integrate with whatever billing provider it needs to.
That's very cool. So let's talk then finally around the tenants. So how are different tenants, distinguishing between different tenants in this?
Sure. So when the billing event is placed onto the event bridge, the tenant ID is going to be there. So where does that tenant ID come from? Usually inside of a SaaS application, when you're making a request, you're sending in some sort of token. So this is not going to work well with anonymous requests, but then again, you couldn't really bill anonymous requests anyway. So all of the requests that are going to be billed are going to be associated with some tenant. And that means that the tenant needs to be authenticated before they can make the
Hmm.
request. That's the general idea. And when you pass in well, there's more ways to do this, but generally what I see happen is that the SaaS application provider will use JSON Web Tokens to model this. They'll use access tokens to pass in to their application. One of the claims inside of that token is going to be the tenant ID, some sort of tenant
Yeah.
identifier. And when the billing event is recorded, then that is going to then be passed along with that billing event. So you can also pass in user if you really wanted to. Again, there's a lot of modification that you could do here to get more information. But generally speaking, because the billing is tied to a tenant, you don't really need user information unless you wanted to use it for reporting. But for this, you just take it from the token that's passed in and then pass it in with the event.
And one thing we haven't touched on here, but is perhaps relevant, is that another option for SaaS providers is to use the AWS Marketplace.
Yes. Yes, correct. There are some SaaS integrations available inside of the AWS Marketplace. What this means is that you can make your SaaS available through the AWS Marketplace, and then customers that are also AWS customers can consume your SaaS application through that marketplace. So there's some integration that needs to be done in that regard. You might not necessarily use Stripe. You might use both AWS Marketplace and Stripe, depending on who you're selling to, because not everyone's going to have an AWS account. So if you want to deliver beyond just the marketplace, and you have to integrate with more just the marketplace. The marketplace is unique in that it will actually show up on the customer's bill. So your own application can be billed via AWS, and then it'll show up as marketplace consumption on your customer's bill. So this may be helpful for customers that want to just keep their spend in one place.
But that's a whole other session,
Oh,
I think,
yes,
to go through that.
absolutely. It's
But
very deep.
I shared a
Yes.
link to the serverless SaaS quick start in the chat,
Mhm.
so feel free to check that out as well.
Yeah.
There's a question around if all tenants share the same KMS keys, or if they have individual KMS keys.
Sure. Inside of this particular application for the table encryption, I assume is maybe what you're referring to here. I'm using the AWS managed KMS key. So this is ironically enough a single tenant application. It didn't really need to be multi-tenant here because you're not dealing with multiple tenants in the sense of a normal multi-tenant application, because this is all the tenant in this case is the SaaS application. It's not the individual tenants, it's the SaaS application is the tenant. So tenants inside of a SaaS application that uses KMS, generally you'll see depending on how it's structured, you can have either if you're storing tenant data and you need to encrypt it, then generally you're going to see a KMS key per tenant, generally. But in this case, I'm just using the built-in encryption.
And then going further on that, then the second part of the question: how do you overcome the KMS key quota per region in an AWS account?
So there are some limits that you can increase, but there are certain limits that will eventually, you probably will top out at them. Once you start hitting those types of limits per region, you have to go into another AWS account. And then that's when you start having sort of shards of customers in your AWS accounts, where you have tenants 1 through 100, for example, inside of the first account, 101 through 200 in the next, etc. This involves the use of AWS organizations and other types of constructs within AWS. So you can absolutely do that. And when you start getting a lot of tenants and you start running into situations like this where you hit these resource limits, then you have to shard out the account and partition your customers.
Right. Then finally, on previous episodes of this show, we've talked about the serverless SaaS reference architecture and the EKS reference architecture. How easy would it be to add this onto those reference architectures?
Sure. It would be as straightforward as integrating the EventBridge SDK. So that's part of the EventBridge SDK is part of the larger AWS SDK. So as long as you can send events to EventBridge using the SDK, and you have the appropriate permissions assigned to the Lambda function or the pod as it may be, depending on which reference implementation you're using. You just add a couple of lines to your application to record the billing event, and it will send it to this, and then this does the rest of the work.
That's great. So check out those reference architectures. Check out the previous episodes if you haven't as well. So with that, Keith, we're reaching top of the hour, so time to wrap up. I just want to bring on a comment that was quite early on in the show.
Sure.
Keith and Bill are my heroes. I think that was a good one.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
So thank you very much, Keith, for joining us today to talk about billing and metering. Any final words for the audience in regards to this? Call to action, maybe.
Yes, a call to action. Billing is an exceptionally important part of your SaaS application because without it, your SaaS application isn't going to survive. So make sure that when you're doing this, that you take this integration as you would on par with something like tenant isolation or identity, other really key components of SaaS of your SaaS application. It's extremely important that you integrate this well into your SaaS application. So make sure to treat it with the same importance that you would something like tenant isolation or identity or any of the other important topics that we discuss.
That's great. All right. So once again, thank you, Keith, for joining us today. Everyone, check out the Keith's blog post. Maybe Bill can share it in the chat once again. And check out the sample repo as well to have a look at this reference architecture. And thanks, everyone, for watching. We'll be back again in 2 weeks for a new episode of Building SaaS on AWS. Have a great day. Bye-bye.